Hi everybody, welcome to the vlog. A couple days ago I sort of shared my reaction to the sad news that Meat Loaf had passed away. I was of course a huge Meat Loaf fan and a Jim Steinman fan as well, and now I just can't believe that both of them are gone. They both passed away within the year, of course. But today I wanted to take a little bit of a more in-depth look back at Meat Loaf's music career. And more than that, just his career in show business in general. It was a career that spanned more than 50 years. And it wasn't just music. He was also an actor. He did a lot of musical theater. He certainly had a non-traditional rise in the industry. It all starts, and I wasn't aware of these early projects until I was just researching for this. His first band was called Meat Loaf Soul. I think he was still named Marvin a Day at this point. I think Meat Loaf was originally just the name of his band. I'm not totally sure about that. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. But yeah, he formed a band called Meat Loaf Soul. Apparently their first gig was at a venue called The Cave in Huntington Beach, where they opened for the band Them and Question Mark and the Mysterians. That's a very 60s lineup right there. And apparently it didn't go so well. They had a fog machine breakdown situation that caused the club to be evacuated, so that's never excellent. The band, yeah, had a million lineup changes, a million name changes, but got a lot of experience performing, not just in some smaller venues, but in larger venues as an opening act for some absolutely huge names like The Who, The Stooges, MC5, and the Grateful Dead. They really paid their dues for sure. Never really became successful. I think they only recorded one single, but they kept touring under various different names like Popcorn Blizzard and like Floating Circus. Some interesting band names there. And then Meat Loaf eventually left that band. I guess he was now going by Meat Loaf. He left the band to do a production of Hair. That's the Los Angeles production of Hair, specifically. And that Los Angeles production was very successful and made a name for a lot of the actors in it, including Meat Loaf. Meat Loaf was able to spin that success in Hair into a recording contract with Motown. You know, Meat Loaf is not the first person you'd think of as a Motown recording artist, but he was. He made an album called Stoney and Meat Loaf with his collaborator at the time, Stoney Murphy. It was not particularly successful. It was the only album that Meat Loaf would put out during that part of his career. And eventually, Motown would just take some of the tracks they'd recorded and put other artists' lead vocals onto them. And that really upset Meat Loaf, and yeah, that one album was the entirety of that recording contract. But they were able to start a touring enterprise, same as the band I was talking about before. They opened for some big name acts. Yeah, so again, Meat Loaf is getting a ton of experience as a performer, which will come in handy. I mean, he performed. I often wonder things like that. With his musical theater experience and his rock and roll experience, I wonder how many performances Meat Loaf gave during his illustrious career. From then it was back to musical theater. He wound up in an off-Broadway production of a play called Rainbow, the original off-Broadway production of Rainbow. And then it's also around this time that he auditions for a musical called More Than You Deserve. That's a Jim Steinman musical, and that would begin an epic collaboration. Jim Steinman had written this musical, and he was, of course, trying to cast it, and he did wind up casting Meat Loaf. Jim Steinman immediately loved him. And immediately following that audition, not only did he get the job in that play, but that's when Jim Steinman came up with the idea of writing a rock album, the rock album that would eventually, and I do mean eventually, become Bad Out of Hell, because I've made a video before, and I'll link to it in the description, about how crazy the process behind the creation of that album was, but it took about 5 years, all said and done. He was in that production of More Than You Deserve. It went fairly okay, but then a lot of the cast members from More Than You Deserve wound up in a little play called The Rocky Horror Show. Maybe you've heard of it. Massive success. That play begins in 1973. Meat Loaf is in the original cast, playing not only Eddie, but he also played Dr. Everett Scott in the musical version of The Rocky Horror Show. I did not know that. Of course, in the film later, he only plays Eddie. But yeah, as I mentioned, that play was massively successful and obviously turned into one of the classic films of all time, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which it's one of those movies that immediately became a cult classic. There are immediately these viewing parties in cinemas, and it's been shown in cinemas all around the world pretty much every year since it came out. To this day, it's still a big deal. You guys know that. I don't even have to tell you that. And as a result, the song Hot Patootie, Bless My Soul, would become one of Meat Loaf's signature songs. He played it at all his performances till the end of his career. Meanwhile, while all of this is happening, Jim Steinman is becoming more and more serious about the Bat Out of Hell project. He's now written the songs for it. They've now been demoed with Meat Loaf, and they then begin the process of talking to record labels and getting rejected and rejected and rejected. Like I said, I've told that whole story in another video, but they got rejected from so many record labels, there were almost none left. They wound up forming their own record label, basically, called Cleveland International, but they did get distribution through Epic, which allowed the album to be released finally after like 5 years of work in 1977, after being almost laughed out of the music industry. That's one thing Meat Loaf talks about, is he felt he had a very hard time being taken seriously. You know, he's a little bit outside the general mold of what a rock star looks like. And he always felt that played a role to why it took so long for him to figure out what his career was and for his career to really blossom. But in the end, it was always the fans. I'm sure Epic Records didn't have, a ton of money behind the release of Bat Out of Hell, but through constant touring, first as an opening act and later as a headliner, the album sort of gained steam. This is back in the day when you used to tour in order to promote sales of albums, other than the other way around. And just a little minutia here, I'm a big Kiss fan, so I have to mention that on that Bat Out of Hell tour, two of his guitarists were the Kulick brothers, Bob and Bruce Kulick, who would later become heavily involved with the band Kiss. Anyway, that tour was crazy. There's some live performance footage from that tour on YouTube. Another thing that made Bat Out of Hell a big deal was that they filmed 4 music videos for it. Now, that was unusual. Music videos were not a big deal at the time. This is still 4 years before MTV would get started in 1981. But those music videos, which Meat Loaf had to basically beg Epic Records to allow him to shoot them, became very successful, due in no small part to, he continued begging record executives. He begged Lou Adler, who had, of course, produced the Rocky Horror Picture Show, to air the Paradise by the Dashboard Light music video as sort of a trailer to the 1977 Rocky Horror Picture Show screenings. And again, that just added to the allure. Just getting a chance to see that video for Paradise by the Dashboard Light must have been amazing. It was many, many years after it came out, but I still remember the first time I watched that music video. I was like, what is this song? And I've always loved songs that are in like 3 or 4 movements. And that song is so epic. It's got tongue-in-cheek moments. It's, the songs... It's hard to explain. The songs simultaneously don't take themselves too seriously and are also these sweeping, ginormous epics. It's hard to be both things, but Jim Steinman's songs were both things. They had the producer for that album was, of course, Todd Rundgren, who apparently had to fight with Jim Steinman a little bit because Jim Steinman wanted every single song to be like a 7 or 8 minute epic, and Todd Rundgren had to be like, listen, some of these songs have to actually be played on the radio. And he convinced him to, for example, I think shorten up the arrangement of the song 2 Out of 3 Ain't Bad, and it worked. 2 Out of 3 Ain't Bad was a big radio hit. That album was everything. It has allegedly sold 43 million copies worldwide. It's also, interestingly enough, I think it's like the most successful rock album like in the history of Australia or something. It's massively popular there, but it's just massively popular around the world. That tour, like I said, very grueling, took place over 2 years. These were massively high energy performances. Meat Loaf actually broke his leg during this tour, which is wild. He jumped off a stage in Ottawa and, broke his leg. Meat Loaf was a bit of a wild man, doing a little bit of partying around that time. After taking a bit of a break after that tour, Meat Loaf was supposed to go back into the studio to record another Jim Steinman project. There was just one problem. Meat couldn't sing. When it came time to do vocal takes, he just couldn't do it. He couldn't find his voice. He became panicked. He started seeking medical help, trying to see what had happened to his vocal cords, if there was something medically wrong. It's believed to have been just kind of a psychological block. I don't think they actively found anything wrong with his voice. But he had to go through, like, I think a year of basically physical therapy to retain his voice. And in the meantime, I guess Jim Steinman got restless because he decided to record the Bad for Good album himself. I actually love this album. It didn't wind up being a Meat Loaf album, although Meat Loaf would eventually record most of the tracks off that album. But, yeah, that album came out in 1981. But by the time that album came out, Meat Loaf was doing a lot better, and Jim Steinman was in a pretty prolific period. He had written a few more songs, and they got to work on the true successor, not the true successor to Bat Out of Hell, that'll come later, but the next Meat Loaf album. And that would become Dead Ringer, which is behind me with, of course, its huge hit, Dead Ringer for Love, which was a duet with Cher, which is very cool. That album was not as successful as Bat Out of Hell, but how can you have an album as successful as Bat Out of Hell? It did do fairly well, and I love the album. Honestly, it's great. Dead Ringer, unfortunately, though, would, for the time being, be the end of his collaboration with Jim Steinman. They had a little bit of a falling out and did not wind up working on their next album. Meat Loaf really wanted to, particularly because Jim Steinman had written some really good songs. These were songs like Making Love Out of Nothing at All and a little song called Total Eclipse of the Heart. Of course, he gave those songs to other artists. Total Eclipse went to Bonnie Tyler, and Making Love Out of Nothing at All went to Air Supply. And those two Jim Steinman songs did the incredible feat of being #1 and #2 on the charts at the same time. A bit of a missed opportunity for Meat Loaf there. I still think he could have done either of those songs well. But he makes an album completely without Jim Steinman, with a cast of various songwriters, including himself. Meat Loaf writes a few songs for his next album, which is called Midnight at the Lost and Found. I haven't really heard his 80s albums, to be honest. I should go back and listen to them. I don't know a lot about his 80s career, but he released a few albums. He released Midnight at the Lost and Found, and then he put out Bad Attitude in 1984, and then Blind Before I Stop in 1986. Bad Attitude did feature a couple of Jim Steinman songs. I don't believe they were new recordings. I believe they were sort of archival recordings. Blind Before I Stop, made without any Jim Steinman songs. So after that, Meat Loaf continues to tour, continues to pursue some acting projects here and there, but after the release of Blind Before I Stop, doesn't put out a new album in 7 years. This all changes, of course, in the early 90s when he reconnects with Jim Steinman and they start working on a new epic project, Bat Out of Hell 2. Now think about it, that's kind of weird. You don't typically see sequels to rock albums, but Bat Out of Hell is such its own enigma that it kind of makes sense. It makes sense to go back and turn that epic album into a franchise, sort of. But like the first Bat Out of Hell album, the music industry was not super stoked on it. They thought that it would totally tank. What, you're going to make a Bat Out of Hell 2? It's like, are the Eagles going to go in the studio and make Hotel California 2? No, but it worked. It was released September 14th, 1993, had many big hits like I'd Do Anything for Love, which is, I mean, Paradise by the Dashboard Light is probably Meat Loaf's biggest song, but it could be I'd Do Anything for Love. That song gets on the radio all the time. The album has Rock and Roll Dreams Come True. It has Objects in the Rearview Mirror May Appear Closer Than They Are. Only Jim Steinman would write a song called that. But yeah, another great album, and another massive success. Just a massive success. I said that Bat Out of Hell sold 43 million copies around the world. Bat Out of Hell 2 has sold 14 million copies around the world, so not quite the same numbers as that, but still massive. A huge career resurgence for Meat Loaf at just the most unexpected of times. It's the same to me as the first Bat Out of Hell album. The music industry didn't really stand behind him, but the fans sure did, and just kept buying copies of these albums. His next album was called Welcome to the Neighborhood in 1995. That album has a song I really like called Runnin' for the Red Light, which Meat used to enjoy opening his sets with. And like I said, through all of these years, Meat Loaf is a consistent live performer. He continues releasing music through the 2000s as well. Like I said, such a long career. In 2003, he puts out an album called Couldn't Have Said It Better, which will go on to be just his third album, where Jim Steinman has no contributions at all to it. But he was in talks with Jim Steinman around this time, because 29 years after the release of Bat Out of Hell, and over a decade since the release of Bat Out of Hell 2, he wanted to make a Bat Out of Hell 3. Jim Steinman and Meat Loaf were in talks to do this. It fell through. It didn't wind up happening, but Meat Loaf wound up making Bat Out of Hell 3 anyway. He would use other songs by Jim Steinman that he hadn't recorded before, some from the Bad for Good album, some from just other Steinman productions here and there. And Bat Out of Hell 3 would come out in 2006, and I don't think Jim Steinman was too happy with it, seeing that he didn't give any sort of sign-off for it, but his songs, again, are used on that album. It spawns yet another successful tour for Meat Loaf. He, again, just has successful tour after successful tour. I will say, and I won't get too into this, but he's sometimes criticized for his the way his voice sounded in probably the last decade or so of his career. But he still brought 110% to his performances, and that's all I care about. He continues, again, throughout all this, he's continuing to act. He does a particularly fantastic cameo appearance in the Tenacious D and the Pick of Destiny movie. But yeah, he's in all kinds of movies still. He never really gave up his career as an actor. The Seize the Night tour in 2006-2007 becomes the Casa de Carne tour in 2008, and then the Hang Cool tour of 2010-2011. And the Hang Cool tour, of course, is in support of the Hang Cool Teddy Bear album, his first album of the 2010s. That becomes, if you're counting, his fourth Jim Steinman-less album. He releases yet another album the very following year, so another prolific period for Meat Loaf, when in 2011 he puts out the album Hell in a Handbasket, and the touring just never stops. Like I said, it's tour after tour after tour. There's the Guilty Pleasure tour, and then there's the Mad Mad World tour, and then in 2013 he does the Last At Bat farewell tour. I remember reading that news and thinking, that's sad that Meat Loaf is finally retiring after all these years, especially because I never got a chance to see him live. But he did come back. He did a little performance called the Rocktails and Cocktails Tour in 2013-2014. And then he finishes it up with what was, I believe, just kind of promoted as 3 Bats Live. Some more tour dates in 2015 and 2016. It was in these tour dates that I finally got a chance to see Meat live. I saw him June 28th, 2016 in Abbotsford, BC. I was stoked out of my mind to be able to finally see him, but a little worried because, again, not only had there been reports of his voice not sounding nearly as good as it had in previous years, but he'd also had some health troubles. In the past 15 years, he had collapsed on stage on 3 separate occasions, once in 2003, once in 2011, and once in 2016, just the week before I saw him. So I thought it was a miracle that the concert was going ahead at all, but it did. I got to see him. He was amazing, and I'm still so thrilled to have gotten that opportunity. It would go on to be, I believe, the 4th to last live performance that Meat Loaf would ever give. That tour concluded a couple of days later. And then after that, some major news came out that I was so excited about. There was a new album by Meat Loaf with songs by Jim Steinman. The album was called Braver Than We Are. The second I saw even the album art for that album, I was just blown away. It's so Bat Out of Hell. And I was under the impression that Jim Steinman had written some new songs for the project, but I don't think he actually did. I think it's a collection of some older Jim Steinman songs, newly recorded by Meat Loaf. That album comes out in September of 2016 and would sadly be Meat Loaf's last album. But it's not really the end of the Meat Loaf story, as Bat Out of Hell is then converted to a musical, and the Bat Out of Hell musical comes out in 2017. Meat Loaf did a lot of work in the promotion of that musical. showing up at various events and such to help promote it. And it was great, and I really hope I get a chance to see some production of Bat Out of Hell the musical sometime. I think it's still going around in various capacities and touring shows, and I'd love to see it one day. Now, I mentioned in my video a couple of days ago that I had followed Meat Loaf on Facebook, and his Facebook was a cool place because he was very active on there. Very clearly not just like a social media team, it was clearly Meat Loaf sharing personal updates, and it was cool to see. And he was very active. He was on Cameo, making those Cameo messages for fans. He was answering questions on Facebook. It was just very cool. And one thing he was talking about was he was eager to get back to live performing. He was worried that his ability to walk had been hampered by this point. He mentioned he would probably have to be seated if he ever did a tour again. He had said that one of the reasons he retired from performing was because that last tour, the tour that I saw, was so excruciating for him. He had gone through so many back surgeries, and it was just apparently just excruciating for him to get through that last tour at all. But he, of course, like I said earlier in this video, had so much experience as a live performer and just loved it so much. He was at home on the stage and wanted to get back to it. He did wind up returning to the stage just one last time, just this past summer, in the summer of 2021. It was so cool to see. I actually didn't see it till just the other day after I learned of Meat Loaf's passing. I had no idea he'd performed again for the first time in 5 years. He played 3 songs on, I believe it was, on the Huckabee Show. And it was just so amazing to see a return to the stage for Meat Loaf after 5 years away from it. That would unfortunately go on to be his last public appearance. In the last few months, he also shared that he had been going into the studio and recording vocals for some as of yet unknown album. Will that ever be released? I hope it does. In one of his last Facebook updates that I saw, he mentioned that the first week of January, he was going to go back in the studio to record the finishing touches for the vocals for that album. Whether he made it to the studio to do that before his passing is as of yet unknown. He unfortunately passed away from COVID just a couple of short days ago, and I'm still kind of reeling from it. I still can't believe it. But, yeah, rest in peace to the legendary Meat Loaf. 50-plus year career. One of the great live performers, great singers, great actors in the music industry. And just, don't really have the words to properly do him justice. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I do rock history videos every Friday. Today I'm uploading on Saturday just because I had to get the Meat Loaf video out yesterday. I was so shocked to hear of his passing that I had to get a video out right away. But yes, I do rock and roll history videos every Friday. And I'll catch you with another one next week. Thanks so much for watching. And I'll catch you guys again really soon.